up, so be careful what you say. I know nobody will say anything bad.
Especially you, Father Ray.
Anybody ever censor anything at St. Vincent?
Well, we want to welcome you all back to We Have a Dream, a world without racism. And we're here with our co-host, Skip Sanders, and our special guest tonight, Dustin and Jill Sanders. So to begin, if you've unmuted, could you please mute yourselves as Father leads us in prayer?
So everyone, let us pray. Holy One, what do we say to you? You're the one who has created us out of unfathomable love, and we stammer to find words to express what that means to us, what you mean to us. Despite this, we find ourselves devaluing, even disvaluing one another for all the oddest and most unreasonable reasons. And sometimes we even devalue and disvalue ourselves. Truly, this is our sad and deepest foolishness. As we gather tonight, give us only one thing then. Graciously give us the ability to see ourselves and to see one another as you do. For in doing so, what we say tonight, what we do, what actions we boldly and decisively take will be just. May your Christ, our beloved Jesus, be our companion and guide as we seek to discover and live the ways of your kingdom. Now, open our hearts and lives to you and to one another, to which we all say, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Father. That's beautiful. Before we introduce our guest speakers, we wanted to mention.
It's fine.
The
There's
problem
plenty
is
of
the table keeps going on with that way.
Could we, Pat and Chuck, could we mute you maybe?
Whatever,
We're finished. Chuck just made a
we're
comment.
just getting organized.
Organized. Okay, we're done.
Thank you. Anyway, before we introduce, we wanted to mention something from our last meeting. We went over definitions of structural, institutional, cultural, and personal racism and white supremacy to get more comfortable with the terms we read and that we hear. And Joe McNeely sent us a great example of systemic racism. Michelle Alexander described how initially, when she focused on the racism of one individual part of the criminal justice system, and that was saving people erroneously sentenced to death, she missed the systemic point. Before that, there was racist policing, arrest, arraignment, bail, prosecution, and sentencing. And for those not erroneously convicted and subsequently freed, racist probation and parole, and the permanent deprivation of rights and opportunities that results from having a felony on your record. And when she herself saw the system, she realized that mass incarceration was a new form of government-sponsored, racialized social control. So that was a great example. So thank you, Joe, for sending that to us. One person may call this systemic racism. One person may call it structural racism. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, he prefers to simply use the term racist policy for anything that sustains racial inequity. So let's be clear, understanding what is happening is what's important and not necessarily the terminology. We also said we would discuss White Too Long this month, but since our special guests were available tonight, Joe Cronin and his crew graciously moved to December to lead that discussion. So we really appreciate it. So thank you all. Now, Skip, I am sure you would love to introduce our guests.
Sure would, and I'm so nervous. Dustin Sanders' giftedness for languages and culture was evident from his earliest years of school, when to his automatic fluency with written and spoken English, he added his passionate interest in Japanese language and culture through 6 years of middle school and high school, culminating in a 2-week homestay in Japan. He attended the Community College of Baltimore County and the University of Baltimore, where he earned both his BA and Master of Fine Arts with a concentration in writing degrees, maxima cum laude. Justin subsequently taught for CCBC, UB, and Stevenson University. During his undergraduate studies, he co-founded Artichoke Haircut, a semi-annual publication of poetry from undiscovered artists. Simultaneously, he co-founded in the Arts North District of the city a bi-monthly open mic poetry and reading venue called You're Allowed. This became the city's largest venue for this form of art and often included his professors. He fulfilled his graduate degree requirement by writing and publishing a collection of connected short stories in his preferred genre of contemporary social horror. For All the Other Ghosts, its title, received laudatory critical reviews. American short fiction, due to its own criteria on length, regretted it could publish only one and not the whole sequence. In this past October, Mason Jar Press published an anthology of short contemporary horror, for which it asked Justin to undertake the full role of editor. It is titled The Horror Which Is Us. And Justin currently is working on a novel which required research supporting some of what he will share with you tonight. In 2018, the Walters Art Museum hired him to be its lead content writer. Along with all of this, I think you're going to experience that he's just a beautiful, magnificent human being. One beautiful, magnificent human being is also the perfect way to introduce you to Jill Muth, my new daughter. Her talents, experiences, desire for global unity, and lifelong passion for all issues of social justice and equity certainly had to draw the two of them together. Jill's undergraduate education at Global College, Long Island University required her to have 3 years of her education out of this country. So Jill has lived in India, Rwanda, in East Africa, and frequently visited Sierra Leone. She has lived in Costa Rica and speaks Spanish fluently. After earning her master's degree in international emergency management from the University of Maryland Global Campus, she spent time serving the Peace Corps teaching in Rwanda, then returned home and taught in the Baltimore City schools before accepting a position with the Baltimore City Office of Civil Rights and Equity. Currently, she's an investigator for that office's Civilian Review Board, the only body authorized to investigate complaints concerning misconduct by police officers. She's contemplating adding credentials in law to add to her arsenal of skills to battle for social justice and equity. So one last shameless father plug. If you want to get an idea of what we mean by social horror, you might want to just check out The Horror Is Us, which is available at the Ivy Bookstore and also Mason Jar Press, which is a local press. Now, Justin and Jill.
Thank you, Dad.
Thank you so much.
The pressure is here after this glowing introduction. It's very nice to meet everybody. I'm going to start off tonight, I guess, by talking about an event that's been kind of on my mind, given the topic which I'm going to get into, which is violent white nationalist extremism. I understand that you've been discussing racism and how it looks in its individual forms and its systemic forms and things of that nature. I find, or at least certainly have found, that sort of the place that I think people are the most curious, but sort of very much afraid to think, is when you see these violent, explosive episodes in the streets, when you see phenomena like QAnon start popping up, and you see, these movements like Black Lives Matter. Where is the opposition? Where is this violent force coming from? White nationalism is kind of the place you have to understand. And so that's what I've been looking into. And the issue I want to start with tonight is the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, which for anybody who's unfamiliar with, is the only time a coup d'etat was perpetrated on American soil. It was when some 2,000 armed white Southern Democrats at the time led a revolt against the newly elected fusionist government. In 2 subsequent elections, the fusionist government at the time, which was a coalition of a lot of different forces and ideas, but really campaigning around the idea of debt relief, railroad scandal accountability, and the idea of poor people should have the currency of their day, which was silver. This party came to government and actually won every state office. And the backlash to that was 2,000 armed white Southern Democrats stormed the Capitol building, kicked out the elected leadership, burned Black property and Black businesses, set fire to the only Black newspaper in town, killed somewhere between 60 and 300 people. They don't really show the estimates. They labeled it at the time in the newspapers Black race riots, but we now really understand it as exactly what it was, a coup, right? This armed insurrection. And the United States' larger response to this was to completely capitulate. They did nothing, and it instituted really a rollback of every single gain that had been made in the Reconstruction era post-Civil War, and it really is what started us into this road of segregation and Jim Crow. Pretty much you can track it right after that, how by 1890 there was a spike amongst the southern states of this rollback of rights. And we kind of understand that now as being part of like this larger paradigm of gains or relative gains being made and then being met with this fierce backlash. And that fierce backlash is always expressed at one point in time through violence. And that's where you get violent white nationalism. And the other thing that the Wilmington Insurrection teaches us is that there is an extreme far right that will never be divorced from, to some degree, because the rhetoric of pushing this is backed up by the force that they bring. When the United States capitulated in the Wilmington Insurrection, the way that they shifted everybody's thinking in this country was to understand that your rights and your freedoms were all subject to the whims of the mob, right? Or as one scholar put it, pardon me, my notes are a little slow here. What happened in Wilmington became an affirmation of white supremacy, not just in that one city, but in the South and in the nation as a whole. It affirmed that invoking whiteness eclipsed the legal citizenship, individual rights, and equal protection under the law that Blacks were guaranteed under the 14th Amendment. That's by Laura Edwards in the book Democracy Betrayed, which is really good. I really recommend that one. So within that understanding, you understand the power of enforcing sort of the most even mundane ideologies, of I don't mean to get political, but essentially you have to talk about sort of this in terms of right and left, and the right-wing ideology that is behind a lot of this, stemming from this traditionalist movement that starts in many ways with interesting occult Nazi roots. And you have to understand that there is a very, very, very long history of this stuff. I've been reading, I think at this point in time, 4 books on the roots of the occult and Nazism, and how that connects to violent white nationalism around Europe, within across the UK, in America, in Southern America. Yeah, I guess we can also talk about in India, but that's getting a little esoteric.
I'll go there.
So one of the ways that this really expresses, and I'll show you guys some images because this can get a little crazy sounding, is you get white cults or Aryan cults, identity cults. Some of them are Christian Aryan cults, like the National Socialist Alliance, the NSA, or the White Alliance, the White Knights. You know, these are white nationalist Christian organizations that have been linked to terrorism in the United States. It's sometimes a little difficult to talk about this because people start wanting to define what is terrorism and does white nationalism apply. You know, the FBI this year has finally said, yes, it absolutely is a form of terrorism, and it is a form of terrorism that the threat level is equal to ISIS, right? Okay, so I'll start this little presentation and show you guys some things here.
You want your first slide, Justin?
Yes, please. Okay, so this is a photo of a member of a cult called the Order of Nine Angles. They are a satanic neo-Nazi cult. They expressly believe in a theistic personification of Satan. Sometimes they express that as a satanic idol known as Baphomet. That's the woman in the photo. This member is posing with his weapon. The Order of Nine Angles is a cult I'm going to talk to you about tonight because they're really specific in their impact and the kind of unique influence they've been able to have on larger right-wing ideology, even some degree mainstreaming. There's some kind of surprising connections here. If I can go to the next slide, please, Peggy. This is a group of the Order of Nine Angles cult, this time in Italy. This is an international cult that has been around for about 40 years now. They have managed to grow their numbers pretty exponentially. They're at one point in time pretty mockingly referred to as the Order of No Members because it was tough to find an actual practitioner. They're now estimated to be at around 10,000 members worldwide. And they recruit through, if I can get to the next slide. This is one of the ways that white nationalists and larger, but certainly this cult recruits. They do it through QR code, right? Because they have learned the technology of the new era. So you can be in a bathroom and see amongst the graffiti a QR code, and just like you would scan at a restaurant these days to get the menu, you would scan this and get taken to a white nationalist recruitment website. If I can get to the next slide. So this is a photo of William Butler, also known as Dr. William L. Pierce, Reverend William L. Pierce, who used to be the leader of the Aryan Nation. William L. Pierce wrote the books Hunter and the Turner Diaries. Hunter inspired the dragging death of James Byrd in Jasper, Texas. And the Turner Diaries has inspired numerous hate crimes, including the Oklahoma City bombing. If I can get to the next slide. This is a recruitment magazine that is put out by a satanic Nazi order called called a satanic neo-Nazi order called The Order. This one in Britain. This one came out around 1998. They say no surrender to Zog. Zog stands for Zionist Occupational Government. It's a anti-Semitic slur. I picked this one out because this particular issue went out pretty heavily ahead of 1999, which saw the London nail bombings by David Copeland. David Copeland was a member of a neo-Nazi order started by a man named David Maillet, who is the founder of the Order of Nine Angles cult that I will talk to you more about. If you can go to the next slide, please. This is a British neo-Nazi rally, again from around the same time as the London nail bombings. I picked this out to really focus on the fact that British neo-Nazism ultimately transports a lot of ideas over to America. And it's important to understand that white nationalism is not disparate pockets. It is a unified order around at this point in time. You know, there is a lot of communication between these groups. It is done both on the internet and in person outside of coronavirus times, but you know, even still sometimes. And the networks that hold it together are largely socially driven and largely held together by the women in the white nationalist movement. If I can go to the next slide, please. So this is getting into actual occultic runes that are now prominent in their imagery. You know, you can see the swastika there. That's pretty self-explanatory. Below that, you have the Wolf's Angle rune. Two together make the SS lightning bolts. Beneath, at the bottom there, you have the Totenkopf Death's Head, which was the symbol of the concentration camps unit in Nazi Germany. What looks like a star inside of a was that a hexagram? Is that the 5 sides? Yeah. Is actually the precursor to the next symbol.
You want it now?
Oh, yeah. Which is called the Black Sun. This is a favored symbol amongst neo-Nazis who dabble in the occult. And we'll talk to you in a minute about why the occult is so important in understanding how this idea spreads and what it does to motivate the violence in white nationalism. But if you can go back, to this slide, above that, that is a perversion of INRI, which above the cross. I have to talk about that. But that's getting again into the actual satanic runic imagery that is really prominent. You know, these things all traffic on sort of like this past glory of the old Nazi Germany, and that's a sort of resounding note that keeps happening with these groups, is this callback to a mythic past. You know, this callback to a time that never was, and the idea that we fell from this place of glory. And so the violence that comes with all of this stuff is really about trying to restore that place of glory. And I think it's really important to put all this in the historical context now. Like, and I think I'm saying, you know, trying to say, when you think about the Wilmington Insurrection and you think about the period after that, that engendered, you know, a pretty much stagnancy of civil rights. We really wouldn't see civil rights gains after that for about another 100 years or so in this country, right? And you see after that, we move into this area of you know, the Nixon-Reagan era, where we saw, you know, the beginnings of mass incarceration and things of that nature. You know, you see that paradigm, this cyclical backlash that happens after any sort of moment of perceived gains. Which brings us to today, where you have movements like Black Lives Matter, which are now being called the largest sustained civil rights movements in history, you know, and the backlash that we're seeing against it in the form of things like movements like the Proud Boys or the Boogaloo Boys, or these Aryan cults like the Order of Nine Angles. And I'll talk to you a bit about the Order of Nine Angles specifically now, because they've had sort of an outsized impact, I've said. And that's because they've recruited very heavily. I said that their numbers ballooned at one point in time. The majority of their growth has taken place between 2010 and 2020, right? With the heavy end of it being post-2016. 2016 saw the explosion of their numbers for a couple of different reasons. One being the election of Donald Trump. And that is on the internet. They have kind of this way of manipulation that makes them kind of a candidate for, they were potentially influential in his election. The Order of Nine Angles believes in magic, right? They believe in the idea that if you concentrate and you focus and you believe in things enough, they manifest in a real way. And one of the interesting things that they learned to do to harness that on the internet is the creation of memes, right? These really popular, you know, instant bits of text and picture that make kind of a snappy point or a joke, right? You know, memes in the Order of Nine Angles cult and in larger right-wing rhetoric now are now referred to as having a quality as meme magic, or something that starts off as a meme or a joke on the internet manifests in real life. One of the ways that you've seen this manifest is if anybody has heard of Pizzagate, where a armed man showed up at a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. to try to free what he thought were trafficked children in the basement of this pizza parlor. That started off as a meme on websites like 4chan, which are just message boards and image boards. It started off as a joke largely and a meme that then took on a real life form. It's really not any different than life imitating art. But this is people have understood that there is a potential to really affect the change rather than have it be serendipitous. So the memes that the Order of Nine Angles traffics in are memes that they say, quote unquote, control the narrative or control the terminology, right? There is a general principle amongst white nationalism that the way you fight your enemies is you do to them what you do to them what you don't want them doing to you first. So if I want to avoid being labeled a hateful bigot, I call you a hateful bigot first. All right. It changes the conversation so that we are now discussing what's people's intentions and attitudes, and it's a very convenient distraction for me to do whatever it is I'm doing on the other side, which in the case of white nationalism has been recruitment and radicalization. And they've done both of those through the internet largely, through what they call the radicalization funnel. The radicalization funnel is the same way that cults work, which is that on its surface, at the top of the funnel, they take what are general grievances, things that pretty much most people will feel. There's a lot of frustration at people at life just under the sort of day-to-day grind, of capitalism. And there's a way that they have found to harness those frustrations. There's a saying on the left that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, right? And anti-Semitism is sort of the motivating, the glue that holds together white nationalist ideology. Well, what the saying anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools means is the idea that your grievances about modern life and who is in control of your life are accurate, but as opposed to targeting them at the things that are producing those results, you are instead taking the easy answer of saying it's because of Jews and blacks and gays and trans people and so forth. So they take, in the radicalization funnel, they take legitimate grievances about, you are overworked, you are underpaid, you do not have the amount of control in your life that you should, your elected officials aren't listening to you. All of your money does go to causes that you don't support, all of these legitimate grievances. And they say, right, it's because there are these secret people in charge that you need to, to rebel against. And they stoke this idea of rebellion. That connects really specifically to the cults, especially the Order of Nine Angles cult, because they take this idea of rebellion to sort of the next step, right? For them, rebellion isn't political rebellion at the ballot box. For them, rebellion is rebellion against society en masse. I'm going to read you a bit here from this book, Black Sun, Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism, and the Politics of Identity. Common to all Nazi Satanist groups is an utter contempt for the values of Christianity and liberal society. The highest praise is reserved for the warrior spirit, heroic courage, and pride of pagan barbarian peoples, especially the Teutonic and Celtic natives of Northern and Western Europe prior to their conversion to Christianity. Nietzsche is regarded as a prophet for the celebration of the Antichrist and denunciation of Christianity as a, quote, religion of slaves. The supposedly weak, humble, and guilt-ridden nature of Christian morality is held up to ridicule. Its secular heritage is held responsible for the prodigious growth of an inferior humanity composed of racial inferiors and fearful weaklings who claim the protection of democracy and liberalism against the fierce and powerful. Most of mankind is regarded as a wasteful burden upon the planet. The Jews and Christians are regularly pilloried for promoting a pacifist, materialist, cosmopolitan society, which they call the so-called New World Order, in which a homogeneous and blinkered one world citizenry obediently consume standardized products for the profit of the plutocracy. The erosion of all gender, racial, national, and cultural differences is seen as a grave threat to human evolution, which it is claimed can only progress through struggle and war.
Oh,
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking me something.
oh no, just give me a 5-minute warning when you.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna wrap up. That's a lot of darkness. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there in terms of who these people are and how they motivate. But I guess the main takeaway to understand is that these are very real people. They have a body count. They are very serious. They are very motivated, and their ideology is not just contained to a far right bubble. You know, there are things that they believe in that have made their way mainstream to the point that when you hear people like Steve Bannon quote Julius Evola, who is a Nazi scholar, you know, and a huge proponent, a huge progenitor, that's the word, of these Nazi cults, you know, you're seeing it come more and more to the mainstream, right? When you are hearing terminology like 4D chess, which started off as an Aryan cult term for how they would manipulate the public, right? You are hearing it mainstream, and that stuff starts in these Nazi cults, and it always ends up expressing itself through violence. We are kind of at a right moment for it. We have a lot of tension in the streets that really has not been placed out yet. We hope that, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but the unfortunate truth is that it's sort of, you know, we have yet to see that to be the case. So that said, the question then comes up, how do we fight it? And what are the steps forward? To which I think the answer to begin with is a well-formed and strong anti-fascist movement, and that expresses itself both at the ballot box and in joining in protest actions. And then Jill can talk to you about the structural, I believe.
So I think my piece is going to be sort of more of a what do we call that? 30,000 feet view, specifically of security forces. So my bachelor's degree, my focus area was in security forces and human rights, and my main focus was in Kashmir. So a lot of the issues that you see in the United States today with racism is very mirrored in India. So if you swap out Muslims and ethnic minorities in India for people of color in the United States, you start to see a lot of the same patterns emerging in terms of just in terms of the issues they face, how laws are legislated specifically against them, and sort of this, you know, I mean, Nixon certainly called it the Southern strategy, in which, well, we make laws that are intended to be racist, but we're not going to say they're racist so that we have plausible deniability. So that was kind of what I studied in India. There is Kashmir is a region in India that is one of the only regions almost entirely populated by Muslims. So the majority in India is the Hindu religion, and there is sort of a mirrored right wing called Hindutva nationalism that believes in an India for all Hindus. And just like you know, in America, some of the white nationalism certainly leaks into the politics. The same is true over there. So Kashmir is actually very interesting. You may have heard it in the news over the past year, where the Prime Minister of India instituted, this is pre-COVID as well, instituted all types of lockdowns, cut off internet and cell service completely in the region. I had friends who were, you know, Kashmiri, who were outside of Kashmir at the time, were not able to contact their friends and relatives, couldn't, you know, call your mom, say hi, hey mom, how you doing? Because cell service was effectively cut off. So that was what I studied while I was there. And when I came back here to Baltimore, I started to see a lot of the same patterns repeating in our own country, in the United States. I got it. It's on the counter. Yeah. Here in the United States. So what we see is we see legislation and we see policies and practices that are all really geared towards continued racism, continued inequity, and they all have that kind of a level of plausible deniability. My current work is in civilian oversight of police forces here in Baltimore. And I just want to give a quick plug for civilian oversight and why it's so important. So when we talk about legislation that follows the pattern of that Southern strategy, probably the first and most egregious example that will come to mind is the war on drugs. And that was very, very intentionally created, both to target Black communities and Black and Latino communities, actually. And it was also created to militarize the police force. So the war on drugs is what brought us SWAT teams, which SWAT teams are certainly very useful when you have a hostage situation, you have an armed gunman who's got someone hostage and you need a force to come in and address that. But those hostage situations are very, very rare. So the war on drugs kind of took SWAT from a very, very niche, very sort of esoteric thing that like you only really saw it in big cities, and it was really only deployed on a very as needed basis. And then all of a sudden, all the police departments started to get SWAT teams. All like, you know, you would have very small towns in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, then they need a SWAT team. And what those SWAT teams started to be used for were executing drug warrants. So, you know, if you look at your police force today versus the pre-war on drugs police force, you know, generally prior to, gosh, I would say the 70s and 60s, you would never enter into your imagination that a police department would own a tank, would own any type of military weapons, would own anything than, you know, what your regular beat cop walks down the street with on their belt. But the war on drugs really changed that. And the other thing that the war on drugs really did was to divorce the priorities of police departments from the priorities of the communities they serve. Because if you think about it, in your average community, do you care who's doing drugs? No, you don't. If they're doing it in their own homes, if it's not having any adverse effect on you, what communities really care about is public safety. You know, I want to know that when I walk outside at night, that I'm going to be safe, that I'm not going to be harmed, that if I am harmed, that harm's going to be addressed. And what the war on drugs did was really move police departments in policy from addressing that harm to addressing both drug sales, drug use, drug trafficking, and certainly those activities do tend to have crime that comes with them, and they do have public safety issues that come with them, but the focus is always on the drugs. So what's civilian oversight? I think one of the really important roles of civilian oversight has is to sort of start to bring those community priorities and police department policies and actions back into communion with one another. Because, you know, when you have a civilian lens looking at your police misconduct cases, you can not only identify you know, issues that when a civilian looks at a misconduct case, they're like, oh no, I see there's an issue there from a civilian perspective, but they're also able to identify policies and practices that are problematic. You may find an issue where an officer used their discretion and what they did was completely within policy, but it was not in line at all with community priorities, community policing, and it really just escalated the situation made it worse. And the industry term for that is lawful but awful. So, you didn't technically break a policy, but what you did was really not good. So civilian oversight helps to bring that civilian lens and bring the community in to say, okay, well, these things are wrong. So, there needs to be accountability for these things, and to push back on that traditional resistance to accountability that you certainly find in a lot of police departments. There is very much this feeling of like, we got to stick together, we got to watch each other's backs. And unfortunately, one of the ways that can manifest is, well, if I'm an officer and I see you doing something wrong, I don't really want to tell on you, because if tomorrow night we're out together and something dangerous happens, I might be scared you won't have my back. So one of the things that the current consent decree is doing is kind of enforcing and strongholding these whistleblower protections for those officers that do want to report misconduct, and also requiring policies that make reporting misconduct an affirmative duty. So whereas, in other departments, it may be that, well, if you see an officer do something bad, you're not required by your policy to report that. And that's what's changing now. Now you will be required, and you will be held accountable if you saw a fellow officer do something that they weren't supposed to do and didn't report it. So that's sort of the push back against accountability, but civilian oversight really helps to bridge that gap between community priorities, community perspectives, and police departments. So that's my brief civilian oversight plug. But the reason that that's so important is the role that security forces play in our lives, and what can happen with security forces when they fall into the wrong hands and are subject to the wrong motives. And here I'm not just talking about police departments. That's certainly the focus of my work right now. And that's kind of what I have the most on top of my head to talk about. But really, I'm also including in this, different factions of the U.S. Army. Certainly, ICE and Border Patrol are really, really high on this list. And one of the things that I wrote my thesis on during my studies in India was how the Indian Army was being used as a tool of genocide. And there are, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly, there are about 8 indicators that would cause an action to meet the criteria for genocide. And many of those criteria were met by the Indian Army's occupation of Kashmir. But as we look to the United States, we see those same criteria being met in the imprisonment and detention of immigrants. You may have heard in the news recently of women being forcibly, required to undergo hysterectomies to prevent them from having more children. That's a huge tool of genocide. Taking children from the ethnic group of their birth and placing them in a majority ethnic group, family separation, also a tool of genocide. And of course, detaining people in camps and separating them from the rest of the population. So those are all things that we see in our security forces today. So it's really important, I think, when we think about racism in America and on a global scale as well, to be aware of how the presence and actions of security forces really impacts and bolsters that. And Justin really touched on it a little bit when he talked about the Wilmington incident, because really what security forces have the potential to do that's very damaging is lend credence and legitimacy. And sometimes in the field, one of the sort of things that we hear as pushback is like, well, you don't care. You don't care when just a man off the street punches someone in the face. So why do you care when an officer punches someone in the face? You don't care about like interpersonal violence. So why do you care about police brutality? Well, if I, Jill, walked up to somebody on the street and harmed them in some way, that's me doing that as an individual. But if a member of a security force, whether it be the Army, the police, Any type of state sanctioned security force takes that same action. That is the state harming you. You are at that point being harmed by the state. And if I were to come up to someone and hurt them, I could be held accountable for that. I'm an individual. It's very easy to hold me accountable. You know, you call the police, you say, hey, I was walking down the street and Jill punched me in the face. This is what she looked like. This is where you can find her. I want to press charges. But people trying to address harms by government forces face a lot of red tape and a lot of resistance. And those systems can be really difficult to navigate. And there's always that air of legitimacy. So one of the things that people are recommending now in police oversight is to reach out to the media and to say to the media, listen, so when you're reporting on a crime incident, you need to get additional testimony from other witnesses. Do not just take the police officers at their word, because there are times when, you know, they may be incentivized to not tell the truth. But if a police officer, you know, says this and then you report it, that becomes the story. The same for state's attorneys, to establish and enforce policies around what we call Brady-Giglio lists. So a Brady-Giglio list is a list that every state's attorney should have on file. And that's a list of officers or, you know, government officials who are caught lying during court testimony. So once, in most departments, once an officer makes it to that list, they are terminated, because one of the key functions of officers is testifying in court for the state, for the prosecution. And if we can't count on you to do that, you can't be a police officer. So, you know, that's one of those really important accountability functions is, you know, when we see that something doesn't seem right, we don't just take the word of a security official because they're a security official. You know, we need to recognize that certain level of immunity, and we need to recognize that some people have ulterior motives and are out here not doing what they're supposed to do. You know, and we get a lot of pushback, especially because there's sort of this American cultural perception of security forces of, oh, you know, they're putting their lives on the line every day, you know, they're doing dangerous work, and that's certainly true. But my sort of response to that is this is how I start out all my presentations when I visit elementary schools to tell them about my job. So I've visited a few, and believe it or not, this is a subject that you can kind of condense down to a level that even a kindergartner can understand. So I always start by asking, who has to follow rules? And, you know, kids will give different responses, but really the answer is everyone. Everyone has to follow rules, no matter what your job is, no matter what you do. And your job may be very difficult and very dangerous and very admirable, but that does not mean that you are immune from the rules and the policies of your job, especially when, you know, you are a public servant. So as public servants, whether it's a police officer, firefighter, the mayor, you know, city council's legislative aide, if you're a public servant, your calling is to serve the public. You are in that servant role. And unfortunately, we see a lot of what we call warrior mentality in some of these security officer positions, where the feeling is, I believe, and, you know, Justin certainly comes across this in some of the internet forums that he visits, I'm the sheepdog. I herd the sheep. You know, your average person out here is a sheep. They don't know how hard it is. They don't even know how ugly it is. I'm the one who has to keep order. And if it weren't for me, you know, this whole thing would be chaos. But that's not the right mentality. The mentality should be one of service. We are here to serve. You know, at the end of the day, I think it's always important to remember who's paying your salary. And if it's the taxpayer, that is who you are indebted to. So even if, you know, even if you may look at someone and say, oh, you know, that's a homeless person on the street, they're not contributing anything, which is unfortunately also a mentality that you see sometimes. You say, no, when that man goes and he buys himself a soda or buys, himself some food, there's sales tax taken from that purchase and that goes to your salary. So that's my soapbox about public service. That's something that's very near and dear to my heart, is that, when you are a public servant, your paycheck comes from the sweat off of other people's backs, and it comes from people's taxes. And that needs to be something that's taken very, very seriously. So I guess I will kind of close out with some action steps. What can you do? So what can you do to sort of push back on these issues of security forces and impunity and some of the damages that can cause? So step one is huge plug: donate to any organizations that are offering free legal help. Everyone needs a lawyer, especially people who may not be able to afford one, people who are in a situation where they're marginalized. Definitely, immigrants who are detained, they need legal help. So organizations like Grievances, organizations like the ACLU, organizations like Maryland Legal Aid are there to provide some of those legal services to those who might not otherwise be able to access them. So I think that's really important. Number two, just like you see in the subway, if you see something, say something. So what I always tell people, if you see an interaction that doesn't look right, and sometimes we always want to give people the benefit of the doubt, right? We always want to say, well, that didn't look quite right, but I'm not sure. What do I know? Report it. Because the worst thing that can happen is that an investigation is launched. We find out, oh, no, actually, that was, all above board, all good. No harm, no foul. That's what we're here for. That's what your tax dollars pay for, is for people to investigate and ensure that these policies are being followed. And best case scenario, you have caught some misconduct and it needs to be addressed. I highly recommend to everybody to get the Witness app on your phone. So it's this app by the ACLU. It's called the Witness app. And you want to get the one for your state. And what it does, it has a couple of really cool functions. So the first function is it has all the relevant laws for if you are stopped by a police officer, if you're pulled over by a police officer, if you're stopped by an agent of ICE or Border Patrol, and even in, I think in times of civil unrest, it'll talk to you about laws surrounding interactions with like someone from the National Guard, for example. So all those laws are right there handy in the app. So if I get stopped and I can go on my app, I can look up, okay, here are my rights during this interaction. These are the rules of engagement. This is what can happen. This is what cannot happen. The other thing that app has that is very, very cool is a feature in which you can record video. So my biggest thing, again, is if something doesn't look right and you feel that it's safe to do so, record. And what this app will do is that you can record, and if something were to happen to your phone, all recordings immediately go to ACLU's cloud. So, let's say you were recording a Border Patrol agent and they came and they knocked your phone out of your hand and they broke it, and you think, oh, my recording is lost, I'm not going to be able to submit that to help this person. Nope, it's in ACLU's cloud. They have it. You just got to contact them and say, hey, this happened, I made this recording, and they've got it. So definitely report, record. If you see something, say something. Support agencies that do know your rights trainings. It's really, really important for all of us to know our rights and to spread that information in our communities. A lot of people, who have never had an interaction with a security officer don't know what to do when it happens. And they don't know, is this okay? Can they do this? And like a really simple example I think of is, if your car is pulled over and an officer says, I'm going to search your car, okay? when you say yes, or you nod your head, or you give any indication, you just consented to a search and you didn't need to. You could say, no, I don't want, I don't want my car searched. And that's completely within your rights. In Maryland, you don't have to produce ID. If someone comes up to, if an official comes up to you and says, oh, let me see some ID, you don't have to give it to them unless you're being detained for reasonable articulable suspicion. That's really important for like ICE and Border Patrol agents. I have some cards from Casa de Maryland with instructions for interacting with Border Patrol agents and ICE agents in English and Spanish. And what it has on the card is the only thing that the person interacting with that agent is required to give is their name. So what they say to people is, okay, so let's say ICE shows up at your door, lock your doors, lock your windows. They will try to come in through the back. They will try to come in through the windows. And they'll try all kinds of things to intimidate and scare people. They'll pound on the door. They'll say, you better come out or you're under arrest. Or they'll say, I have a warrant. And there's all different kinds of warrants, and different warrants mean different things. So, a warrant to detain isn't necessarily a warrant to come in your house and arrest you. So what this card does is the only thing you're required to give is your name. So somebody can write their name on the card. And the card also says, I decline to speak to you. Unless if you have a warrant, please push it up against the window or slide it under the door. And what they can do is they can slide that card under the door, and that lets that agent on the other side of the door know that, hey, this is a person who knows their rights. They've complied with what they're required to comply with. And, that helps to keep them safe. So just disseminating that information in communities about what your rights are, that's the other big thing that you can do. And of course, I don't know if you guys here at St. V's have a legislative committee, but if you don't, highly recommend one. And there's a lot of great organizations you can get in touch with to sort of help. Because, as Catholics, and I'm a lifelong Catholic myself, legislation and the laws that are being passed that affect our neighbors is our business. And I think we do have a duty to get involved in those and to make sure that the laws that are being passed help our neighbors as much as possible and do as little harm as possible. I know there's currently a package of police reform legislation that's going through Annapolis right now that is promising some great things, including repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is one of the key barriers to accountability. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights gives an officer 10 days before they have to respond with a statement to an accusation of misconduct. I don't get that on my job, and you probably don't either. On our jobs, if somebody says, hey, Jill cursed me out, my supervisor gets to talk to me about that day and take the corrective action that they feel is necessary. So those are just some of the, pay attention to the legislation. League of Women Voters is an excellent resource in that regard. They maintain summaries of all upcoming legislation on their website, and they track that legislation. They can tell you where it is, what's going on with it. Those are called reports from State Circle. And those are just reports on the different pieces of legislation that are being passed. But, pay attention to that stuff, because especially at the state and local level, that's where we have the opportunity to make the most change with legislation that we advocate for. You would be surprised on these key issues what you are empowered to do. A lot of people don't realize that you can go and sign up to give testimony on any issue. You can show up, maybe not now because of COVID, but you can testify on different issues and say, hey, this is why this law is important to me. Or, hey, this is why I don't think this law should be passed. And really cool thing that I only learned about very recently is that, let's say you say, there's a law that should be on the books, but it's not. And this law would really help. So you can go down to Annapolis, you can meet with I think it's a legislative librarian. They will help you write up that law. They'll help you research histories that would impact that law. And then you can take your law and you can walk around to the different senators and representatives' office and say, hey, would you sponsor my law? This is a law I'd like passed, and this is why it's important. Could you be a sponsor? And you can get sponsors for your law. There's ordinary people can help draft and pass legislation. So that's a really cool thing that a lot of people don't know that you're able to do. So those are my just sort of action steps. I know it seems like a real big, scary issue. Oh my gosh, what can I do? But those are just a few actionable steps. And of course, support people in your community that are experiencing this harm and this misconduct. Believe people in your community who are experiencing this harm and this misconduct. You know, take it seriously. So that's my soapbox.
And I think the biggest action step is the one you guys are doing now, which is getting the education.
Yeah, and having these conversations.
I know it can seem like that's not doing a lot or doing much, you know, but as someone who has been reading about some kind of wild stuff that sometimes I talk to people about and kind of get this impression that I blew their mind a little bit with the existence of these things, you know, it says to me that there's really not a lot of knowledge about these groups, about how these things operate, about, you know, the laws and how God knows about the intersection between all this stuff and law enforcement, you know. So getting the education really is a crucial, critical step, you know.
Justin,
Thank you.
I think what really blew my mind is when you showed how something that I thought was like a far out fringe group that was just doing kooky stuff and you just had to kind of keep them damped down comes into the mainstream. Like when you talked about the young guy that was carrying the gun during the demonstration, and the fact that the police down the thing with the gun. Then after, you know, the shooting, there was a long lull and lapse before anybody really started taking action on it. And you were tying that to how he had been, you know, propagandized and recruited, and that this is what the right-wing groups do because you can't get them for it. That's what he did. But they put in all the ingredients to get him to do it. And they were just exercising their freedom of speech. That's the scary stuff.
Term called stochastic terrorism. It is actually learned from this cult. The leader at one point in time converted to Wahhabist Islam and brought modern terrorism tactics back to the UK. And that's the internet emergence of it. This idea that we can load as much propaganda and radicalizing rhetoric out there as possible, and it's going to create somebody who will do the work.
Thank you
Like
so
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say another example is the guy who shot up the church in Charleston.
Absolutely.
So we're going to thank Justin and Jill, but first of all, are there any questions for them before, because we do have a petition that I shared with Jill that I'll be sharing with all of you, which is a anti-racist action that you each can take, which addresses the Police Bill of Rights. And I'll put that up in a minute, but any questions for Justin or Jill?
Yes.
Yeah, Denny?
Yes, on that Police Bill of Rights, is the rescinding of the qualified immunity part of that bill that's going through?
I believe it. Okay, so qualified immunity is not part of the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. I believe that qualified immunity exists at a federal level. I could be wrong about that, but I do believe that this package does mention qualified immunity and take steps at the state level to try to address that issue. And actually, I think the upcoming president is going to address qualified immunity as well. At least that's something that was mentioned. Yeah, it was in the platform. So I think addressing that at a federal level is really important too.
Thank you.
Father Ray, did you have a question?
Yeah, this is for Justin. In your presentation, it certainly sounds like these right-wing groups really build off of particular vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
And what they end up doing is take away those vulnerabilities or plaster them over so they're not disturbing the individual any longer. So I have a couple questions. One is there some analysis of what those particular vulnerabilities are? And then secondly, are there ways for us that we aren't doing now to address those vulnerabilities so organizations such as the right wing can't make use of them in a destructive way? Do those questions make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. So the interesting thing is, previously, with the emergence of like, especially like the white national, the violent white nationalist groups, they were pretty much, and they still largely are, but we are seeing some differentiation, at least in the data. But they capitalized on youth. I'll quote one of their leaders. This guy named Bill Riccio, who used to run what they call a war house out in Alabama, who said, we want your youth because where you have the youth, you have impetuousness. Where you have the youth, you have somebody who wants to fix all of the world's problems right now. Where you have the youth, you have a disregard of consequence. And so like they really are still, to a large part, you get between the ages of 17 to 25 or so. Now, the difference that we're seeing is the education level is wildly varying now, that you are getting, a large degree of college educated, extreme right nationalists. You're getting a large degree of post-college educated extreme right nationalists, and so the particular grievance that's being addressed there are, what they call grievances with modernity, right? So essentially, you don't feel like a man anymore. You don't feel masculine enough. There is this emasculation that you generally feel in your life. It's, a lot of people capitalize on, like Jordan Peterson is kind of in that upper funnel of the alt-right, and he says essentially, oh, well, that feeling of emasculation comes from, you've lost all these traditional gender roles in your life. You're no longer the sole single breadwinner, and that engenders all these other bad habits amongst you, slovenliness and excessive masturbation or whatever. So the general feeling of masculinity and gender roles is a really big one in the current moment. That's the one they're trading off of very, very highly. They also trade on the economic anxieties. They are still majority movements comprised of the poor and working class. And so they are, capitalizing on legitimate grievances about debt, about low income, about, too long hours, healthcare, all the stuff, people who work a lot of jobs where injury is prone and then who don't feel that they're taken care of afterwards, So that's the kind of hard part, where it's like a lot of times there's legitimate grievances, and addressing them, to get to the second question, and how do we, sort of address them, one step is political, when you address the grievances that are coming out of our life, then you start to alleviate that for a lot of people. The other part is cultural, and that's always the harder part, it is a combination of love and firmness, I believe, because there's a point at which their intolerance has to be cast out and not tolerated. Then there's also a point of which we have to try to meet these people and bring them back from the edge, because the sad thing is you really did tag it, this relationship that a lot of people develop with the alt-right, the far right, the extreme far right, is an abusive relationship. Mm-hmm. It isolates them. It cuts them off from friends and family. It feeds them a worldview that makes them feel disempowered and angry and upset all the time. And there's really nothing more that it can give them other than perpetual anger, which is why it always culminates in violence. And it goes to these further and further lengths of fantasy, which is how you get the occult tie-in. So, building a community around that person, stops that cycle,
So in many ways, you're talking, and then there'll be the last question. So in many ways, where they're not grievances, it really is about struggles toward identity.
Yes, absolutely.
And that maybe as a culture, we have to ask ourselves some questions about, are we helping people to find a solid identity that makes them makes them less vulnerable to far right and other cult kinds of environments?
100%.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks,
Better than
Justin.
me in that short span of words. Yeah.
And just kind of to piggyback off of what Justin says, I know that I was speaking with a friend of mine in 2016 after that election, and she was from a traditionally rural area, and she was explaining to me that, you know, when you live in a city and you live around a lot of other people, there's a lot of different ways that you derive your identity. You have different friend groups, you know, you have your job, you have your church, you may be part of a book club, you know, there's a lot of different fonts for identity. But if you're in a very isolated place and you don't have any of those social connections, you don't have any of those other ways of deriving an identity, and your identity becomes sort of, you know, what's the word, pigeonholed to, I'm a white man, you know, or I'm a Christian, or, you know, whatever. And then that's where there's this like fierce identity politics, because, you know, we're filling our cup from one place instead of from all different places. Sorry, that just made me think of what my friend Christy said.
I agree.
Well, thank you so much. We're truly grateful to you both, Justin and Jill, and not just for tonight's presentation, but for the sustained commitment to social justice and the difference that you both make, especially in Baltimore. So we truly thank you. And we're honored that you joined us tonight.
Thank you guys for
Thank you so much for having
us.
us.
I was on a Zoom this week with Showing Up for Racial Justice, and they were discussing the police reform. And there are two critical issues. One, Jill talked about the repealing of the Officers' Bill of Rights, which blocks transparency and transferring control of the Baltimore Police Department to the city from the state. And Serge developed a petition, which I'm going to show you now. If you'll give me a second.
We will.
Thank you. So it looks like this, and I'll be sending this out to all of you. And let me slide it over so you can see. So there's a place for your name. It's to President Ferguson. So our senator in District 46, which is where St. Vincent is, and a lot of us live in 46. Our senator is the president of the Maryland Senate this coming year. And the other three representatives that we have all signed on, and they agreed to this petition, but Senator Ferguson has not yet. And so this is encouraging him. So it does ask for your name and address, but it also has a place for organization. So here's where you could put, if you don't live in 46, here's where you could put that you're St. Vincent's and it's in zip code 21202, so that if you want to add in comments that your church is in District 46 and you spend a lot of time in the city, and then you can add your name. So it says that the goal is 100 signatures, but they're actually trying to get 500. So I will send this out to all of you. And if you feel the passion and you would like to sign it as an anti-racist thing, I would really appreciate it. And I'll get that out. Last month, we asked you to research Mary Mother Lang. So what did you learn? Anybody learn anything they didn't know? I don't know, Father, you might be cheating. You probably already knew a lot. No, go ahead, Father. You can unmute if you. You're still muted. Oh, you don't have anything? Okay, did anybody research?
Mary
Well,
Ann.
I'm always amazed that she had to live through so much racism to do what she did constantly. And not only racism from society, but racism from all the priests and the bishop and everybody. She had a hard time getting the support she needed, and especially when she wanted to form a convent of Black sisters. But she had to be very, very strong. And the prayer that we have for her sainthood, talks about that racism and how she loved everybody in spite of that. So I admire her for that.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. Mary Ann?
This was not recent. It's something I probably have started to gather maybe over the past year, but as you know, I was a member of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Scranton, Pennsylvania, years ago. And they were founded by a woman from Baltimore whose mother was a refugee. She was the foundress was biracial and illegitimate. And that was something that was never spoken of in all of our history of the community training. Mother Teresa first bonded with, she was one of the original sisters with Mother Mary Lang.
Mhm.
And then she was asked to go to Michigan and start her own community. And even now, the oblates have felt a little friction that she picked up and left. But Mother Teresa, all her life, had to deal with bishops who, first of all, were upset that she was a woman with ideas, and even more so because she was a person of color. And it was horrifying to read some of the condescending ways in which both of them were treated.
Great. Thank you, Mary Ann. I learned that she was a domestic at St. Mary's Seminary. I hadn't known that. Yes, Father.
Yeah, just one thing, not anything more about Mother Lang, except I think if you have not done it as a spiritual practice, go over to St. Mary's on Paca Street, go to the under chapel and sit there. That's where she taught children.
Mm.
And it's quite an experience to sit there and just to be thoughtful about this woman and her commitment, and what she did in that space, and what those children had the opportunity to experience, because this woman was willing to believe in the gospel, in herself, and the children that she served.
Thank
Father,
you.
right, that was also where enslaved persons worshiped.
Yes.
Who were Catholic.
Thank you all. And for next month, we're going to ask you to do a little research on Frederick Douglass. And I know Ray Barr will have input since he's working in Canton now for a statue of him. And that's a statue of Frederick Douglass, not a statue of Ray.
That should happen too.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we have received great materials and suggestions from some of you. And what we would like to suggest is, instead of sending it to us, volunteer to spend 15 minutes one of these months presenting it yourself or with a friend. It would be a nice break for the group, and we all learn when we're presenting. So we are going to suggest that to you all. And also, the one other follow-up item was reparations. So did anybody come up with that hook that we need, or some great idea?
Keep thinking, it'll come.
Jerry Sokola? You're muted, Jerry. There you go.
Don't have a great idea, and I didn't come up with a hook because I think I wrote this to you. I think we need to learn about reparations deeply. I don't think it's just about us doing charitable works or raising money for a cause. I think
we could talk to the Episcopalians.
we need to,
Bring that up.
that's one.
We have discussed, we'll definitely be doing something on that down the road. Thanks, Jerry.
Episcopalians have, set a goal to raise money to give, I think, institutionally in terms of poverty issues. But I don't think that's what the real reparations movement is about. So I would love to, and there have been great articles in the New York Times. There's certainly books about it, and perhaps there are people who could speak to it. So before I could have an idea or would commit to anything, I really want to understand what it really is about. And
Actually, we have one name that we're looking into, and we're looking into that for a future presentation. And I agree with you, Jerry. I think it was either Joe or Ed who said in the very first meeting, what we do has to have an impact at the systemic level.
right.
So to me, that's what we mean by reparations. It's doing something that systemically begins to balance the scale.
Yes.
I thought that it's very impressive what the, hello?
We can hear
We
you.
hear you.
Okay, I think it's very impressive what the Episcopal Diocese did, researching how specifically the Episcopal Church directly and indirectly through the affluent slaveholders who contributed to the Episcopal Church in Baltimore created wealth, institutional wealth in the Episcopal Church that is directly derived from slavery. And the work of doing that sort of subverts the argument that I had nothing to do with it, I'm not benefiting from it. And now they've taken steps for some economic reparation. But the work of taking their people through this understanding, to me, was an impressive
That's right.
undertaking, and they're here, so we don't have to go far to find some example.
So am I unmuted? Okay.
You're good.
We can hear you.
So, I mean, I also was impressed with the Episcopal. I think we need to look at the Archdiocese of Baltimore, and how historically they were complicit. And then from there, perhaps, I don't want to say demand, but that we need a capital campaign within the Catholic religion to deal with the reparations, whether it be scholarships or more housing, to actually do a capital campaign where we put our money where our mouth is. And I think we need to start by looking at the history of our diocese and the ills that were perpetrated under their watch.
Jim Casey's looking into the construction of the basilica.
Excellent. And I don't know if the crew next month is going to be discussing that at all. White Too Long, of course, is about the Christianity. I don't know if they're going to carry it into the
Well,
Archdiocese or not. Joe, I'm
Hey.
looking for you.
Peggy, this is Jack Bonner.
Hi, Jack.
Jim Casey is looking into the construction of the basilica and be giving that a time frame, and he just wants to see what labor was used and you know whether there was some abuse of slavery in the building of the basilica. So he's doing the research on that, and he wanted to be here, but he has another commitment that he had to attend every third Wednesday. So he wanted me to let you guys know that, you in particular, Peggy.
Thanks, Jack.
Peggy?
Yeah, Mary?
Yeah, I just want to say that as many weeks as we're spending discovering the problem, I think it will take as many weeks to discover what reparations mean and what it should mean to us. That it's such a huge topic and a lot of misunderstanding, and there's a lot that we need to learn. And you know, how we want to go about it. I think the hook is everything that we've been learning over the past several weeks and what we'll continue to learn.
Peggy, this is Janice.
Who said it? Janice.
Hi. There's an article that the Houston group read, The Case for Reparations from the Atlantic by Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Right.
So it's not a whole book, it's an article, and that, you know, I could find the link for that and send it to you, and you could send it out.
That would be great.
Yeah,
Thank
there are
you.
many links we could do
Yeah.
if we're ready for that.
So then, Peggy, you've asked us to research Frederick Douglass. I would challenge that we all need to research some way that our Catholic Church has been culpable and bring it to the table next time we meet.
I also agree with that, and I'm sure this is going to come up with the discussion of white too long. I feel we also need to recognize that the racism and the white supremacy that continues to have primacy in this country is not just about what happened in slavery. It's been happening, and including in the last, in our lifetime.
Yeah.
We all continue to support it.
The moves of white Catholics to a certain political agenda that has been about white supremacy, and the church is involved, is
Yes.
very real and very current.
Yes.
And we're all continuing to be racist until we can get rid of the systemic racism and change it. We all continue to be racist. So it's not just the white supremacists. We're in there too. Al?
Peggy? Oops.
Yeah, Bishop Laurie, Archbishop Laurie, got up and spoke at the Bishops' Conference about what's been done in Maryland as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, and about racism. Yeah, he spoke, that was yesterday. And he was talking about what a great resource we have within the Archdiocese. And I think, Skip, the people that are now involved with that. And I'm wondering whether or not all the work we're doing here, or that's being done here, can somehow be used and spread through the diocese, and leveraged. We are a small group here, and we're doing, and what you guys are doing in this, Skip and Peggy, is an incredible resource. And I think by using your connections, Skip, within the diocese, you might be able to get something going, especially if you're going to deal with the whole question of reparations, which is a scare word beyond all scare words, maybe not beyond, but
all kinds of reparations.
All kinds of, how do we get that down to all of the people in the diocese? And I know that Lori challenged people to start setting up discussion groups within the parishes, et cetera, or the committee did, which we participated in, I believe. Do you have any thoughts on that, Skip?
Yeah, a couple. Al, first, to be really honest, I think, if anything, we need to be a stimulus to what the Archdiocese is doing. My experience has been it does good stuff, but it takes very safe steps with the good stuff. One thing that would help with what Sue was talking about would be, Peggy, we can try to see if Mary Ellen Russell or Sharita would give us the historical summary that was done of the Archdiocese's involvement in racism. Laurie used it as the opening of his apology. It was beautiful. Of course, it stops right there at the "we're sorry," and that's why we kept saying every week, saying you're sorry does not mean reparations. And so I think that report would be a very good place to start, because it was from the archbishops on down, okay, the very first archbishop, and everywhere it was. So, but I also think Sharita Thomas, who is sort of spurring the continuation of what the original task force on racism was trying to do, might be good to actually have her come and be part of one of our sessions. But ultimately, Al, I think we're going to wind up being a stimulus or a catalyst, and we need to figure out how to do that, because otherwise they'll take safe step after safe step. I mean, Ray and Mary Catherine know all about that. when you really get your teeth on something kind of hard, they slip away. I mean, you know, his whole frustration with what has lacked and beyond the boundaries being moved forward, it becomes the same thing in this area on race and racism.
One of the things that Sharita was part of a regional meeting today with Bishop Madden, and she really emphasized the importance that the office is trying to focus on is not talking but doing. And that's been one of the problems in the past. A lot of talk, but it never ended up going anywhere.
Yes, Father.
So they're really trying to address that issue. I think one of the things I had thought about was maybe having Sharita come and talk at one of our liturgies, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
When we talked about inviting her to discuss with this group, she's been calling Skip because she's overwhelmed. So we were trying to give her a little bit of a break because she's still getting acclimated somewhat. But yeah, definitely she would be a perfect resource. And how to get the other parishes involved. I've tried to make inroads with a couple, and I'll tell you, they don't think they have anything to do with racism or
That's what her job is. That's what she's trying to do. That's what she's organizing.
That's why, firstly, it needs to start at the top.
Right.
And then it needs to be strongly requested to all the parishes within the diocese.
Yep, that's her job. That's what she's organizing, right?
In the meantime, if you do want a way to help in the education arena, because I know a lot of people feel that that's one of the most important ways we have to let people get educated on the accurate history. The Women's Education Alliance provides scholarships and other school support to Catholic community schools serving economically disadvantaged children and families in Baltimore City. And James and John was always a part of that alliance. And besides tutoring, there's a way to provide scholarships, and you can keep a child through the period. Mary Catherine's been very involved with them. And it's a great organization. If you don't want to wait and you want to get started helping education, you could do something in that arena.
Jerry Sakala is involved on the board now also. Yeah.
That's right. So Skip, did you want to add anything, or we can close?
Yeah, I think we're ready to close. I just want to thank this group. You all are just fantastic. I mean, I love my sisters and brothers in this parish so much, but I just think you're, and I hope you found tonight really interesting.
Thank you.
Love not everybody here, but also Justin and Jill. I don't know if they're still on, but we love them too now, Skip. They're part of us. So next month we will gather on December 16th. It's the third Wednesday at 7 p.m. if you want to mark your calendars. And we truly thank you for joining us. And thanks again to Justin and Jill. And we're going to close with a prayer.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say,
Sure.
This is Turunashin
Hi,
Salwan.
I can't find you, but hi.
I know. I just want to say I really learning a lot. And I feel like I'm into the history, and even though I just learning everything, but I really very impressed with the way you and others organize and then speaking the truth. And guess what? Last month or something, we talking about a story about how God does change everything, and how and now even though we did all together, look. People get together, they, wherever the guy, whomever president was, look what happened. So God is so mysterious and powerful, and I really enjoy it, and I will appreciate it, and thank you so much. That's what I would say. God bless everyone.
Thank you, Tanisha. We're also praying for Ethiopia and everything happening there too.
Yes.
All right, so if we can pause just for a moment. Lord, help me wallow in my discomfort. Sit with my disquiet. as we journey through this racialized pandemic, seeing clear inequities, anger, and hurt. Aid us in our focus. How are we people for and with others? Help us open our eyes. What voices are absent? Help us acknowledge our history. What have we done to exclude, persecute, and silence? How have we been complicit? Forgive us for not being there, for not doing enough. How can we invite, empower, and lift up these voices? We need to do better. Who can we invite to our tables? Help us listen to these voices. Help us reflect and help us to prayerfully act, not to erase our discomfort, but to be fully present, seeking solidarity, seeking repentance. Lord, help us wallow in our discomfort. Let us lean in. Amen.
Amen. Can you send that to us?
Well, I stole it, so it's, and just changed a little.
Still send it.
That's all right. We like this, what you stole.
I'll be
Right.
happy to.
Share your booty.
I just didn't want you to think I wrote it. All right, thank you all so much.
Thanks.
I'm gonna stop the recording now, but if anybody wants to stay on for any reason, let me know.
Good night, everybody.
Have a blessed Thanksgiving, everyone.